and we will get started. Shalom lekulam, and my name is Yair, and I'm here from Philadelphia. And I'm really excited to introduce Michelle, who's going to introduce Avi. And I have a couple of introductions, but because this is going to be a really packed and fascinating conversation, I'm just going to try to do really brief introductions. So first of all, I'll tell you, even though Michelle is going to introduce Avi, I just got to tell you that I personally am fascinated about everything that is happening in the Middle East. And I think that everything is interconnected. And I've heard so many talks and podcasts from Israel, from the United States. But then recently, about a month ago, I think, Avi came to Philadelphia and was hosted by the JCRC and the JCC. And his talk blew my mind. And I felt the need, I spoke with Michelle, and I felt the need that we have to have him here on a webinar with more people to hear what he has to say, because it's really, really important. So just a few basic ground rules. This is going to be a session between 60 and 75 minutes. From my experience, it's going to be 75 minutes. So Eastern time, hard stop at 9:15, because Avi actually has a lecture 15 minutes later in person. This is going to be a hybrid talk, differently than some of the times that we have only conversation back and forth. Avi is going to have a formal conversation about 30 minutes or so, and then everybody is welcome to ask your questions through the Q&A section in the bottom of the screen. So these are some of the announcements. Now I just wanted to mention that I belong to two organizations, and one organization is called Hope for Israel Alliance. It's a grassroots Zionist movement that is really led with volunteers all over the world, mostly Israeli expats from the United States, Canada, Australia, pretty much most of the countries, even smaller countries in Europe. And all that we want to do is to advocate for the people of Israel and their democracy, fight against anti-Semitism wherever it is, United States, Norway, Australia, and also provide practical support to the campaign of releasing the hostages. The last thing I'm going to say about Hope for Israel is that I think many of the people here are aware of the World Zionist Congress that is happening very soon. And there are many parties, and I would recommend that everybody reads about it and chooses whatever party they think that fits them. But HIA has joined the AIDS Coalition, which is a United States nonprofit that started after October 7th, and is basically a fundraising platform to support dozens of Israeli grassroots movements and projects aimed at providing support, supplies, services for the people of Israel and rebuilding the community after this devastating war. So that's a couple of words about AIDS Coalition and Hope for Israel Alliance. Now, I'm very fortunate to tell you about Michelle, who has been a partner now I don't know how long we know each other, Michelle, for 6 months or so. So Michelle is the CEO of the AJMA, the American Jewish Medical Association. I'm a proud member of this organization. And they have been doing so much because we have all seen in healthcare, psychologists, social workers, nurses, physicians, on social media, everywhere, so much explosive anti-Semitism in healthcare, which is so dangerous. And the American Jewish Medical Association, led by Yael Alas, the founder and president, and Michelle, who's the CEO, basically are taking the torch and fighting this anti-Semitism and eradicating the anti-Semitism in healthcare, which is so important. So Michelle is the CEO, but she's also, from the DC area. I'm not going to go into the details, but she's been involved in so many organizations and political activities and the board of this and the board of the Federation. And she really is an unbelievable person. And she has helped us with so many different events, including in-person, Zoom, and so many activities, connections. She is just she's one person, but she's really a team. So with that, Michelle, jump right into it. Thank you so much for hosting with me this really important podcast, or webinar, I should say.
Always a pleasure and an honor to work with you, Yair, and to share important information like Avi's going to share tonight with so many people. So I have the distinct honor of introducing Avi Melamed. Avi Melamed is a geopolitical Middle East expert, intelligence analyst, former Israeli intelligence official, and senior Arab affairs advisor. Avi is the founder of Inside the Middle East, Intelligence Perspectives, ITME, and Yair will be sharing some information about Avi's organization and his work in the chat. This is an apolitical, nonpartisan, educational nonprofit institute. Avi is the author of 3 books on the region. His most recent book is Inside the Middle East, Entering a New Era. He's also the author, producer, and host of The Seam Line, a 5-part docuseries exploring the many layers of the conflict in and over Jerusalem. His newest film, Inside the Middle East, The Primer, is an educational film designed to provide a Western audience with an understanding of the factors shaping the region, equipping diverse viewers with vital education through on-the-ground filming and authentic voices from the Arab and Muslim world, often absent from Western discourse. ITME's newest initiative, Voices from the Middle East, about the Middle East, is an international fellowship for motivated college and graduate students. Inside the Middle East, Voices from the Region, about the region, educates passionate students, emerging global leaders in the Middle East complexities, equipping them to bridge divides, drive informed dialogue, and inspire meaningful change. Avi's fluent in Hebrew, Arabic, and English. He's a frequent commentator on international media platforms such as ABC, Al Arabiya, Al Hura, BBC, Arabic and English, Bloomberg, CNN, Fox, NBC, Reuters, and Sky News. He's a permanent contributor to USA Today, and I have to say I've heard him speak in person and here in Miami. He is you're all in for a treat. You're all going to learn new things that you never understood before, and I welcome you to engage with us and ask your questions in the Q&A. So without further ado, it's my honor to introduce Avi Melamed.
Yair, Michelle, thank you so much for this very kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, shalom, good evening. I'm in the West Coast. For those of you in the East Coast, it's an evening already. Very honored and flattered to be here in this webinar with you. We're going to talk about the pivotal moment in the Middle East that is known by the name of the October 7 attack, but we're going to talk about it in a wider perspective, trying to understand the ins and outs of that significant event. And we'll try to explore that from different perspectives. The first thing that I would like to do, talking about it, is trying to understand together what led to the October 7 attack. And then we'll try together to understand the impact of October 7 attack on the region. And then the concluding part, trying to understand what I call the domino effect that the October 7 event triggered in the Middle East. So let's start with the first segment, asking ourselves, what led to October 7? I will argue that actually October 7 is the outcome of the confluence of three major ideologies that have joined together and gained momentum across the Middle East, starting as of the last third of the 20th century. And those ideologies, which in a moment I will describe shortly, joined together and actually resulted, among other things, and I emphasize among other things, also October 7 event. Two of those three ideologies are actually ancient, and they are coming from the hub of Islam. Islam is the religion of most people in the Middle East. It emerged in the Middle East in the 7th century, and quite quickly has expanded, becoming what is known as a caliphate, a kingdom. And parallel to that, there has been growing power struggle within Islam regarding the question who is entitled to lead this caliphate. This power struggle resulted in two major camps in Islam. A majority of Muslims are known as Sunnis, they are about 84%. Minority are known as Shiite, a political faction, the supporters of Ali, the fourth caliph of Islam. The Shiites are about 14% of Muslims. And both camps basically have been struggling over leadership of the Muslim world for centuries. Quite often, this power struggle has been not only ideologically and politically, but also physically, violently. However, those two ideologies, basically, those two camps, Sunni Islam and Shiite Islam, has something in common. And what they have in common is that they have a very globalist, expansionist outlook of mankind, history, and trajectory. Basically, they share the notion or the vision of a world that is a globalized Islamic world ruled by the Islamic religious codex that is rather known by the name of Sharia law. In the Sunni model of that vision, this global entity is rather known by the name of caliphate. In the Shiite version, it's rather known by the name of imamate. a term that associated with another significant term in Islam, Shiite Islam, and this is the term of imam, spiritual leader. The Shiites believe that the major branch of the Shiites, known as the 12-ish, believe there has been line of 12 spiritual leaders, starting with Ali, the fourth caliph that I mentioned before, and they believe that each and every one of those imams actually is connected to a divine source of knowledge, and therefore he is immune from mistakes, and his rule has to be blindly obeyed. The major branch of Shiite Islam believes that the last one of those imams disappeared as a little boy in the 12th century, in the 9th century, but they believe that he is not dead. They believe that he is alive and waiting outside of time and history to be summoned up to come and lead mankind to salvation. In the Shiite terminology, he is rather known as the Mahdi, if you wish, Messiah. He also known by the name of the anticipated Imam or the absent Imam, or in Arabic, Sahib al-Zaman, which means the master of time. However, those two ideologies that you see, the Sunni Caliphate and the Shiite Imamate, have this thing in common, looking at this world through Islamic perspectives. And right in front of you, for example, you could see to the left-hand side, you could see a couple of groups that are coming from the hub of this Sunni Caliphate model, like, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood that was established in Egypt in 1928. Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic movement, was established 60 years later in 1987 in Gaza Strip. Hamas formally defines itself as the offspring of the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. The word Hamas, by the way, means a religious enthusiasm, and it's also the initials of, I will say it in Arabic and I will translate, Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, the Islamic resistance movement. I want you to remember this term, resistance. Shortly we'll understand why. You see other groups that are coming from the hub of this Sunni Caliphate, like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Islamic Jihad, and others. At the same time, there are groups that are coming from the hub of the Shiite Imamate camp, like, for example, the Hezbollah. The most well-known one, of course, is the Hezbollah in Lebanon, but there are 17 branches of Hezbollah worldwide. Another interesting congregation is Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi, a group of Iraqi Shiite militias that formed in the beginning of the 2000s. Beneath that, you see the logo of Ansar Allah, the military power of Houthi, congregation Shiite tribes in Yemen that came to center of the media attention in the last year. Beneath that, you see the logo of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, the spine of the Mullah regime in Iran. So these are two out of the three ideologies. The third one is a contemporary one. This is an ideology rather known by the name of the resistance and defiance. In Arabic, al-Muqawama wal-Mumana. This is an ideology that appeared in the center of the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, and it vows non-compromising animosity to the West. It views the West as a declining civilization, as a decaying civilization. It vows to eliminate the presence of the West in the Muslim world. And as part of that, it also vows to eliminate the state of Israel, arguing that the state of Israel is an outpost of this Western civilization, arguing that Israel is not indigenous to the region and therefore has to be violently outrooted under the banner of liberating Palestine. So these are the three ideologies: the Sunni Caliphate, the Shiite Imamate, and the resistance and defiance ideology. And the question, of course, is how and why do they join together to result, among other things, October 7? When you look at the geostrategic landscape of this region, starting as of the last third of the 20th century, you could notice that both Sunni Caliphate model as well as the Shiite Imamate vision, they both gain momentum on the ground. In 1979, Islamic Revolution in Iran, Iran becomes a Shiite theocracy under the leadership of the mullahs. The mullahs are the Shiite clergies. The mullah regime in Iran translated the vision of Imamate into a geostrategic blueprint of expansion across the region, titled by the name of Exporting the Islamic Revolution. The purpose or the objective of that expansion is to position, in the end of the day, the mullah regime as the hegemonic power in the Middle East. And indeed, since 1979, the Mullah regime has been very effectively creating networks of armies of terror, like the Hezbollah in Lebanon, supporting Iraqi Shiite militias that appeared in Iraq in the beginning of the 2000s, supporting in the mid-90s the creation of the military power of the Houthis, Ansar Allah. But it's not only the Shiite Mullah regime that gained momentum through the building of those networks of armies of proxies, but also Sunni caliphate model gained momentum during that period of time. For example, in 1980s, we witnessed the emergence of both Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the Palestinian arena, reminding you they are coming from the hub of the Sunni caliphate. 1988, we have the establishing of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. In the beginning of the 2000s, ISIS, the offspring of Al-Qaeda, is emerging in Iraq and in Syria. And at some point between 2013 to 2018, it established sort of control on the western part of Iraq and the eastern part of Syria under the banner of the Islamic State. Make long story short, when you look at the region for the last third of the 20th century, you could see how both Sunni caliphate factors as well as Shiite imamate factors are gaining momentum on the ground. The translation for that, practically speaking, was the establishing of a powerful axis that is going to be known by the name of the axis of resistance and defiance, محور المقاومة والممانعة. We are looking at a network of those different militant groups, some acting as a semi-state entities, like, for example, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza Strip. And this network of this semi-state terror organization, massively armed by the Iranian regime, provided with a lot of military know-how and so on, basically act as proxies in the service of the Mullah regime vision of positioning itself as the superpower, the hegemonic superpower in the region. One of the interesting things to notice about this network, this axis, is the fact that you will not find Iranians in this axis. It is totally based upon Arab inter-ethnicities, either Lebanese or Iraqis or Yemenite or Palestinians. And with the exception of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, who, reminding you, are Sunnis, the rest, meaning Hezbollah, Iraqi Shiite militias, the Houthis, are Shiites. They are Lebanese in their nationalities, or Iraqis in their nationalities, or Yemenites in their nationalities, but they subscribe first and foremost to the order of the Mullah regime in Tehran because they view the most significant component of their identity, the fact that they are Shiites, and therefore they view the Mullah regime in Tehran as the highest source of authority. One significant component in this whole structure that was built across the region, starting as of the last third of the 20th century, in the context of eliminating the state of Israel, are two aspects of this blueprint that are rather known by the name the Ring of Fire and unifying of the arenas. The concept of Ring of Fire actually portrays the blueprint towards the stage or the final stage of eliminating the state of Israel. According to that blueprint, those semi-state entities, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza Strip, Iranian-backed Shiite militias like Pakistani, Iraqis, and Afghanis that have been based in Syria up until recently, all those factors will create a sort of a ring of fire around Israel's neck, and they will be backed in a secondary circle by Iraqi Shiite militias, by the Houthis in Yemen, and the third circle, of course, Iran itself. And the whole idea actually says that once they are already locked on the ground and set to move on, they will all attack the state of Israel as one, from all directions, from Gaza Strip, from Syria, from Lebanon. There has been even attempts to expand this power base to Jordan. And basically, they will eliminate the state of Israel. This concept of coming together from all directions and attacking the state of Israel has been also known in Arabic by the name of Wahdat al-Sahat, which means unifying of arenas. That day had a date. The date was October 7. This has been, roughly speaking, the process that led to October 7. And we have to emphasize, we are not looking at something that was built during a year or 2 years or 5 years. We are looking at a very long-term, meticulously calculated long-term strategic program or blueprint that aimed in the end of the day, among other things, to bring the end of the state of Israel. And Hamas is initiating October 7 attack under the impression that indeed the day of unifying of arenas has come. Hamas' impression was not baseless, because in the months before the attack, there were meetings of the leaders of the axis of resistance across the region, in Beirut, in Damascus, in Baghdad, and in the summer of 23 also in Iran. And Hamas heard from his colleagues to the axis of resistance. They told him in Arabic, "Ihna jahizun," which means we are willing, ready, and able. Another thing that incentivized Hamas to launch October 7 attack was in the context of the inner power struggle between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, and particularly the main pillar of the Palestinian Authority, the Fatah organization. The two major Palestinian bodies, Hamas on the one hand, Fatah Palestinian Authority on the other hand, are struggling for the leadership of the Palestinian people in every possible aspect, ideologically, politically, operationally, and so on. The gaps between the sides are not bridgeable, and they have been deepened following 2007, when Hamas crushed violently the rule of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza Strip, and ever since 2007, Hamas de facto took control over Gaza Strip. All the attempts of Muslim Arab leaders to reconcile the parts, attempts that resulted in an agreements that were signed between the parts, all those attempts failed. Those agreements quickly find their way into the garbage can. So this has been, roughly speaking, the factors, the processes, the currents, the players that joined together in a gradual process that has been going on for more than 4 decades to result, among other things, October 7. So what was the impact of October 7 in the region? So October 7 takes place. Now there is a war in Gaza Strip, and very quickly the Mullah regime is starting to internalize the fact that it is going to lose a very significant arm. Why the downfall of Hamas in Gaza Strip is a bad news for the Mullah regime? The answer for that is that as part of this master plan of the Ring of Fire and unifying of arenas, one of the major significant components is the need to constantly perpetuate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For the Mullah regime, who market itself as allegedly the defenders of the Palestinians, quite effectively, successfully marketing that to the Arab world, it has been a strategic interest to make sure that the conflict not only lingers, but will escalate. But in order that to happen, someone needs to fuel the flames. The someone that needs to fuel the flames is Hamas and Islamic Jihad. They are the one that actually fueled the flames. And when you look at the trajectory of the conflict for the last 4 decades, you will find out that they have been the major perpetuators of that escalation. This is a marriage of convenience. When Hamas and Islamic Jihad enjoy a massive, generous Iranian support, financially, militarily, and so on, and in return, their mission is to fuel the flames of the conflict. Hence, understanding why the Mullah regime has been alarmed with the situation in Gaza Strip post-October 7, concerned with the possible downfall of Hamas in Gaza Strip. To try to address the challenge, the Mullah regime has activated its different proxies across the region to put military pressure on the United States, on the international community, and on Israel. And the objective of that pressure is to force Israel to stop the war in Gaza Strip. So right immediately following October 7, on October 8, Hezbollah in Lebanon is starting to attack the Israeli northern communities. The leader of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, says, I'm going to stop this war or the attacks only once there is a ceasefire in Gaza. Parallel to that, Iraqi Shiite militias are starting to attack United States bases in Iraq, in Syria, in Jordan. Houthis in Yemen are starting to attack maritime in the Bab el-Mandab Strait, connecting the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. In parallel to that, Houthis are starting to attack Israel as well. From time to time, Iraq Shiite militias are also attacking Israel. And during 2024, what we are witnessing is actually not only the war in Gaza has not stopped, but it basically expanded to different arenas. And particularly the most significant moment is the fact that for the first time, twice during 2024, Iran is directly attacking Israel kinetically from the Iranian territory. Of course, it has resulted in an Israeli retaliation. The same applies as of in the context of the attacks of the Houthis. Israel retaliated 5 times, the Houthis in Yemen, attacking in Yemen. So all in all, we are looking at a very significant situation where during 2024, the war is escalating, expanding. It's a slippery slope to different arenas, and that's going to result in some very significant outcomes. When you look generally at this whole thing, this whole year, what happened, you see that Israel has been very successfully restoring its deterrence posture. That was, of course, at rock bottom in October 7. There are a couple of significant milestones in that regards. First is the fact that Hezbollah has been defeated. This is something that is enormously significant because the Hezbollah positioned itself for the last couple of decades as a regional power, and rightly so. Hezbollah himself obviously marketed itself as such, and indeed massively armed by the Iranians, he did play a regional role, involved in the war in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, even in the West Sahara. Now comes this collision with Israel, and within a couple of weeks, the Hezbollah is militarily defeated. I can tell you that this is something that sent an enormous shockwave across the Middle East. As someone who has been covering the region for 40 years professionally, I've come across something I've never came across, and this is sentiments expressed by Arab analysts that compare Hezbollah's defeat to the defeat of the Arab armies in the war with Israel in 1967. Not less significant, of course, is the outcome of the Israeli-Iranian exchange of punches. The bottom line of that is that Iran lost or significantly sustained damage to its deterrence image. This is something that is enormously significant because for the last 4 decades, Iran was in a win-win situation, activating its proxies, yet at the same time totally immune from repercussions. That basically enabled Iran an enormously significant deterrence capacities. Nobody wants to deal with the Iranians because of that. Yet now, following these 2 exchange of punches with Israel, and particularly the second Israeli retaliation, Iran deterrence image is at rock bottom, which is something very significant. So you got a situation where major components of the Iranian-backed axis of resistance, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the mullah regime itself, are basically sustaining significant damage. This whole process is going to result or trigger what I call a domino effect. The immediate and most dramatic domino effect happens in Syria. We have to understand why is it so dramatic. Syria, under the rule of Bashar al-Assad, became an enormously significant geostrategic ally of Iran. And for Iran, Syria has been the cornerstone in this whole structure that the mullah regime was building in the last 40 years. The reason for that is because of its geographical location. Syria actually sits in the heart of a land corridor that you could see in front of you on the map, connects directly Iran through Iraq, through Syria, all the way to the eastern basin of the Mediterranean to Lebanon. Through its proxies in Iraq, through its strategic partnership with Bashar al-Assad, through its strategic relationship with Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Mullah regime de facto established a land corridor that enabled the Mullah regime a direct land access all the way from Iran to the Mediterranean, to the Eastern Basin. This has been one of the biggest cornerstones of the Iranian regime expansion policy and vision. Assad regime and its rule in Syria were enormously significant in that regard. That explains the fact why Iran has been so massively involved in the war in Syria to save Assad regime. When the war in Syria started, when the people uprised, Iran rushed to send to Syria the Hezbollah to fight and to help Assad regime. Iran itself streamed to Syria weapons, ammunition, oil, salaries. It is estimated that Iran invested about $50 to $60 billion to maintain Assad regime in power. Indeed, in 2018, it seems as if it was a successful process. In 2018, the rebels in Syria are cornered, niched to the northwest part of Syria, mostly backed by Turkey and Qatar, and Assad and the Iranian axis could mark a significant achievement. Assad was sitting quite safe on his seat, and it seems as if they won. But then, in the end of 2024, within 2 weeks, Assad regime is falling down. The Syrian rebels are launching, in the end of November, a parallel offensive, massively supported and orchestrated by Turkey, and within 2 weeks, Assad regime falls down. It happened because of the impact of October 7 on the region that I was describing before, meaning Hezbollah defeated was unable to rush yet again to save Bashar al-Assad. The Iranian regime, losing their details image and now exposed, practically speaking, following the Israeli second retaliation, also were unable to rush and to save Assad regime as they did in the past. Putin, that was a very significant component stabilizing and securing Assad regime, Putin is engaged in the war in Ukraine. The rebels, and backed by Turkey, identify this moment of opportunity. They read accurately the impact of October 7 attack on the axis of resistance, the weakening of the axis of resistance, and thus they launch this attack, resulting in the downfall of Assad regime in Syria. And basically the meaning of that is that the cornerstone in this structure that the Mullah regime has been massively invested building in has been taken out, and with that the axis of resistance has been significantly weakened. The domino effect continues, and right now we could look at different arenas and try to evaluate different aspects of this domino effect. There are some positive aspects, both in the sense of the specific different countries involved, as well as in the context of the geostrategic landscape of Israel. For example, in Lebanon and Iraq, what we have witnessed following this process, we have witnessed the strengthening of a locally, nationally based powers who rejects the Iranian influence. We saw that in Lebanon with the fact that now there is a new president in Lebanon, the chief of staff, Joseph Aoun, that has been elected after 2 years where the Lebanese politicians failed to elect a president. The reason they failed to elect president is because the Hezbollah was vetoing any candidate. Hezbollah says it's my way or the highway. Following its defeat, the Hezbollah basically had to back down, and Joseph Aoun, which is clearly not a Hezbollah's person, is elected as president of Lebanon. In Iraq, we are witnessing the strengthening of the Iraqi Shiite nationalist camp, who is opposing the Iraqi Shiite camp that is loyal to Iran. This is yet again another potentially significant development. Another significant development potentially is the weakening of the Mullah regime in Iran. In fact, we are looking currently at a situation where many analysts, and I join that perspective, assess that the Mullah regime during 2025 may face an unprecedented challenge to its endurance. This is the outcome of a combination of the weakening of the axis of resistance, the expected tough sanctions by Trump administration, and the enormous increasing challenges economically, socially in Iran, definitely something to follow very closely. However, there are other arenas and players that should be viewed very skeptically. Syria is presenting a big question mark. Now there is a new rule in Syria that its roots are coming from the Sunni radical camp, reminding you Al-Qaeda, ISIS. Though the current regime in Syria is going extra mile to convey a message, an image of pragmatism and moderation, we should look at it very skeptically with a big question mark. Currently, it is estimated that this new rule is mostly engaged in the rehabilitation of Syria, and in that regard, he needs the support of major Arab players who in return demand stability. However, we should look down the road very closely to see how things will evolve in Syria, a big question mark. Not less significant is the story of Turkey, and particularly when we talk about Erdogan, the president of Turkey. Once again, Turkey can mark a big achievement following the downfall of Assad regime and the weakening of Iran. Based upon the, I would say, the bitter experience the region has with Erdogan, that more than often is a very provocative leader, walking always on the edge and always kind of like stirring the pot and resulting some tensions, we should look very closely to see how Turkey, and particularly under the rule of Erdogan, is going to monetize its achievement. For currently, there are some major concerns that one of the things that will evolve down the road is that Turkey will become more and more hostile to Israel, and thus could present a creation of a new axis that will also be hostile to Israel, this time an axis that will be overly based upon Sunni groups. Finally, a few words about the Israeli, Palestinian, and Arab states arenas. Looking at the Palestinians, I would emphasize Hamas is not going to disappear. It is part and parcel of the Palestinian people. I think that it's enormously significant to follow the inner discussion within the Palestinian, particularly vis-a-vis this whole concept of the resistance that became very much praised and romanticized in different Arab circles, including, of course, the Palestinians. There is such an inner debate within the Palestinian, yet, however, you could find both those who are basically saying to Hamas, you have inflicted an enormous destruction on the Palestinian people, yet you will find also within the Palestinians and the Arab world, those who basically continue to praise Hamas and his path. The outcome of this inner discussion will have a lot to do with the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israel can mark, on the one hand, restoration of its deterrence image that is going to be parallel with the configuration of a new totally security strategy that has different elements. At the same time, Israel could look at some opportunities for a better horizons, geostrategically speaking, but at the same time also to follow very closely some of the things that I mentioned before, particularly in the context of the inner Palestinian discussion, Syria and Turkey. As for the Arab world, when you look at the Arab world, for the last 40 years, the Arab world has been very reluctant, or major players, to take really proactive a role in the story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and rightly so, because they knew that it was Iran and the axis of resistance that in the end of the day dictated the agenda, unfortunately, the radical agenda, and under those circumstances, the involvement of major Arab players was relatively irrelevant. Today, I think that we could say, given to the weakening of the axis of resistance, yet not disappearance, but given to the weakening of the axis of resistance, I think that we could anticipate and expect much more proactive involvement of major Arab players, namely Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, in the trajectory of the conflict, hopefully in a positive context. One last thing as an educational note, I've mentioned before that there has been an interesting, we saw for the last 4 decades an enormous escalation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, yet at the same time in the Western discussion, in the academia circle or the intellectual or the media and policy making circles, the discussion focused on two-state solution and peace. It was totally detached from what was happening, unfortunately, on the ground when dozens of thousands of Israelis and Palestinians were killed as the conflict escalated. This failure of reading, I think, could be attributed to two major arguments or reasons. One is the fact that when you look at the discussion of in Western circles, the discussion centered around the narratives of the sides. The Palestinian narratives that talked about occupations and settlements and genocide and injustice. The Israeli narrative that talked about the Palestinians rejected everything they were offered. They are not willing to have peace, and so on and so on. And what the problem was that those narratives have been presented as if they are the reason for the escalation, but they are not. What we saw tonight is basically the reason for the escalation. And finally, another explanation is the fact that, unfortunately, discussion in the Western circles about the conflict has been to a large extent flattened and subscribed to buzzwords, slogans, and concepts and theories that, in the end of the day, offer no ability to understand, let alone really effectively impact the trajectory of the conflict. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, I'm concluding my presentation and opening this session to your questions.
This was amazing, Avi. And I'd like Michelle to start with her first. I know that she has about 1,000 questions, and we have so many questions in the Q&A, and it's because, really, Avi, your talk, as always, is so stimulating and fascinating and educational. You're really an amazing speaker. As always, as we mentioned last time when we saw you in person, if you don't feel comfortable with any of the questions, I don't think that you will, but if you don't, just we'll pass to the next question. So we have about 30 minutes or so for a lot of questions and hearing the opinions and insights of Avi. So Michelle.
Avi, you're always amazing. And as you can see with all the questions, there's so many, it's such a stimulating conversation. I have a little different, and some of the questions that you have in the chat, and Yair will be posing them, are very specific to some of the things you talked about. I have a general question for you. Tonight you're talking to a friendly audience. It's the AJMA audience, it's the Hope for Israel Alliance audience, it's people who are friendly to your talk. Have you spoken to audiences that are less friendly? And when that happens, because a lot of us are facing that in our workplaces and in our school environments. When you do that, what is the biggest pushback you're getting to this factual, historical information that you're providing that may not be the perceptions they had? What kind of pushback? Like, where's the pushback that you get? I'm just curious.
Well, Michelle, thank you. I must confess and say something interesting. I have been doing hundreds and hundreds of presentations in my lifetime. I really never ever came across a significant pushback. The major reason for that is because I'm currently right now in the midst of a big lecture tour across North America. I've been doing, as part of this tour, more than 20 or 25 campuses in the United States, including campuses that are basically potentially campuses where you can find the pushback. Actually, right now, I'm supposed to have an event in Berkeley in about an hour.
Good luck.
I did come across some questions by audience that basically clearly coming from a political perspective, which is totally legit. But I never ever came across a real pushback. The major reason is because I'm saying to people, look, I'm not an Israeli spokesperson. I'm not a Palestinian spokesperson. I'm not advocator. I'm an educator. I'm presenting you a picture that to a large extent does not present in the Western discussion. I present this picture and you are welcome to take it and do whatever you want to do with that. And I think that people are very appreciative of that perspectives, because we know for sure that people, they don't need more narratives and op-eds. People need the context, the facts, the understanding. And I think that explains the fact that in the end of the day, as I said, I never ever came across a pushback.
Interesting.
So I'm going to start asking several questions, and feel free to answer shortly or longly. And then I'll pass it back to Michelle. So the first question, which I actually compiled several of the questions, is more specifically about Iran. And, the questions, there are several questions. One of them is, what do you think is the situation internally in Iran that really how boiling it is in a way that the own people will perhaps topple the Ayatollah's regime because of all the things that are happening? And another few questions about the same thing is that, is this partially this stability or instability that is being caused is basically a result of the work or whatever the actions of the United States and specifically Israel? So bottom line, people are interested in hearing more about what's happening in Iran.
Well, it's an interesting timing because about 2 or 3 hours ago, I had a long conversation with someone Iranian about the situation in Iran. Let me quote what this person told me. He said, all the components for a major revolutions are there in Iran, for major uprising. He says all the components are there. You got all the elements. I'll be more specific. Iran suffered an enormous economic crisis. According to estimation, 50 to 60% of the young people in Iran are unemployed. Iran, the ruler regime fails to provide the basic needs of its people, energy, heat, electricity, and so on, which is ironic given the fact that Iran is an enormous, oil-rich country. Another issue that is less known but should be emphasized, Iran is a semi-arid state. It is dry, it's very dry. It's estimated that about 75% of its land that used to be for agricultural purpose are not fertile any longer. It is totally dependent upon supply of water, particularly from its neighbor to the east, Afghanistan, something that already results in a growing friction between Iran and Afghanistan. There are enormous challenges in Iran, socially, economically, politically. There is a lot of unrest. We all witnessed this uprising of more than once of young people in Iran. One of the interesting figure that I came across when I was talking with one of the sources in Iran, it was something very interesting. Said in the last uprising in Iran, you may remember the story of Mahsa Amini, the young Iranian woman that was killed by the Iranian Basij militia because she didn't wear hijab. He said, following that, there was a lot of uprising in Iran, you may remember it, and he said to me, almost 40% of the people that were arrested, thousands and thousands were arrested, said almost 40% of those people were the sons and daughters of Islamic Revolutionary Guards officers, which is something which is very interesting when you think about it. So to sum it up, in Iran, according to the best of my understanding, all these components are there, yet it is not clear whether it's going to arrive into an uprising that will topple down the Mullah regime, because the Mullah regime, as we know, as we saw, will oppress it brutally.
And one more follow-up question, which again, I'm compiling many questions. I think that many people are interested in the Houthis, until the war, not a lot of people knew about the Houthis, and suddenly, they've been a force within Yemen that is fighting another force, but now suddenly we see missiles falling in Israel, in Tel Aviv and Eilat. So several questions about the Houthis. We haven't heard a lot from the Houthis recently. It's kind of quiet. Is this because they're just taking a pause, or are they weakening? Is it because they are a proxy of Iran and they are weakening because Iran is weakening? Or is it because of the attacks, the focused attacks of the Americans, of the UK, and of Israelis? So bottom line, people want to know a little bit more about the Houthis.
Well, the Houthis, as I said before, it's a congregation of Shiite Iraqi tribes from the north part of, Shiite Yemenites tribes from the north part of Yemen. Generally speaking, when you look at the history of Yemen, it's the never-ending wars and conflicts. There was a time where there was a monarchy in Yemen, in the north part of Yemen, and it was a Shiite-based monarchy, even though it's a different branch of the major branch of the Shiites. The Houthis in Yemen Yemen is a country that is torn apart with many different warlords and powers, tribes, and so on. And the Houthis are basically part of this whole system. They launched a coup in 2014, ousting the legitimate Yemenite government. When they launched that coup in 2014, actually resulting in a war in Iraq, in Yemen that continues up until now, they basically mostly it was according or around the inner domestic demands of the Houthis that to a large extent were very legitimate, basically asking to take a much bigger part in the share of the big cake, sort of speaking, of Yemen, because Yemen has a lot of resources. However, the Houthis could mark, as far as they are concerned, a very significant upgrade in the last year because of the fact that they have been massively armed with the best of the weapons Iran can offer them, because of the fact that they are strategically located in one of the most strategic locations on this planet. About 15% of the world trade is going offshore Yemen, which of course provides the Houthis an enormous pressure card, and they used that card. So as far as the Houthis are concerned, they basically elevate their position, taking advantage of the story of the Israeli-Hamas war. Now, the Houthis obviously are conveying the message of non-compromising animosity to Israel and to the United States. They are conveying their non-compromising devotion to the Palestinian cause. One could doubt to what extent they are really devoted to the Palestinian cause, but the bottom line, they position themselves as a region's significant player that has a lot of power and impact. And by the way, this is something that the Iranians, of course, very cleverly invested in because they realized that one of the ramifications of that is that the Saudis and the Emiratis that have been attacked by the Houthis and have been engaged in a war with the Houthis for the last couple of years, obviously are aware of the fact that on their backyard from the south, you got a massive Iranian-backed power that is very substantial, that present them a very significant challenges. The meaning of that, among other things, is that the Saudis and the Emiratis are looking around to find the counterparts that will join them to push back, to counter these Houthis attacks. As part of that, you can understand Israel, and particularly following the impact and the domino effect of October 7, Israel is becoming more and more valuable partner in the eyes of the Saudis and the Emiratis. All in all, we should look at the Houthis very closely because they are going to play a very significant role regionally and beyond regionally. You know, it's interesting, in 2015, or even towards the end of 2014, I wrote an article and I was referring to the coup of the Houthis in Yemen, and I said, watch out for the Houthis. They are going to become an enormously significant strategic player. That's exactly what happened. We should definitely look at the Houthis as a significant regional player.
Michelle, you're on mute.
Sorry, I had muted. So I had another question I wanted to ask you, but I almost want to ask you now, given that you had a crystal ball a few years ago, what's in your crystal ball now?
What's in my crystal ball?
Good question.
The only thing I don't have is a crystal ball. What I have is the hard work. And by the way, talking about predictions, I must say, I always put my work to the test of reality. In other words, I'm making predictions. You could read my books and you could read my articles. It's always there. The reason I'm doing that is because it's the only way where I can evaluate whether my reading of reality is accurate or not. There is no magic wand. I can't find shelter beyond nice concepts and ideas. It's not an op-ed. It's a professional analysis, and I have to do that. I'm glad to say that I have a very, very significant record of a very accurate prediction. Yeah. So looking ahead, here is what I will say. I don't anticipate an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement in the foreseeable future. This is something that I've been saying all along for many, many years in my positions and not in my positions. That the two people are simply not in a place where they can even start moving towards something like that. It's not a game of blame. It's just professionally reading where the people are, the Israelis and the Palestinians. I do anticipate that in the foreseeable future, Syria will not present a security challenge to Israel, at least in the foreseeable future. I will follow very, very closely, another player or state that we almost relatively didn't talk about tonight, and this is Jordan. I will follow very closely what's going on in Jordan. There is some very complex processes that are taking place in Jordan, which has a lot of ramifications, because Jordan is a very significant component in this whole jigsaw, this whole puzzle of the Middle East. I would anticipate a growing involvement of major Arab players in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I do anticipate some refueling of friction between Turkey and some regional players like the Arab states, including potentially refueling of tensions between Turkey and Israel. These are a couple of observations that I can provide at this point. I think that we are looking at a region that obviously now is going through this enormous reshuffling of political and geopolitical landscape with different ramifications that come along. These are the major things that I will note at this point. I will also anticipate, as I said before, 2025, the Mullah regime in Tehran may face its biggest challenge ever. It may push the Mullah regime to do some significant concessions regarding its nuclear project. We'll have to wait, of course, and see how things will evolve in 2025.
Before I move to the next question from the audience, I remember that when I heard you speak live, there were several questions to you, and you mentioned something that stuck with me. You said, you know, we live here in the West world, either Europe or in the United States, but our lenses, we really fail to understand some aspects of what's happening in the Middle East, of the Shiites, of the Sunnites, of the resistance. What do you think that, like, maybe you can repeat what you told us back then? What do you think is important for us who don't have the Middle East lenses and when we think about the Middle East?
Yes, you know, I always saying about the Middle East, the Middle East doesn't necessarily think in English. And it's something that I've gained during my many years in my positions, where I had a very close, intimate relationship with the Arab world. I'll give you an example so you can understand how much it's very much different from the mindset. I kind of like alluded to that before. The story of the resistance that I was talking about. Look, October 7, that was done under the banner of the resistance, resulted in an enormous death and destruction in Gaza Strip, the whole other thing that we talked about. Now, in a Western perspectives, you would probably expect, and that will be probably the case, that the power, our leaders who are responsible for something like that, they will pay the price for this terrible disaster that they inflicted upon their own brothers and sisters. And indeed, in the Palestinian and in the Arab discussion, you hear the criticism on Hamas, on what he has done in October 7, on the story of the resistance, which, by the way, in Western circles, the same concept of resistance has been romanticized, glorified, while in reality there is nothing romantic about resistance. It inflicted an enormous death and destruction across the Middle East. But in the context of the inner Arab, I would add convoluted mindset, I will tell you that there are many people still who praise and romanticize and vows the concept of resistance in the Arab world. Yesterday, leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, was buried. Hassan Nasrallah was a very significant leader for the last 40 years. The man inflicted terror, death, destruction upon his own brothers and sisters, upon the Lebanese, upon the Syrians. The man was involved in lots of atrocities in the region. Yet, there are many people in the Middle East, in the Arab world, who praised Nasrallah, who continue to praise Nasrallah. And this is an interesting mindset that is totally not absent, not to say not understood in the Western mindset. Leaders of Hamas, who has been interviewed in Arabic following October 7, and coming under a lot of criticism, because the anchors in the talk shows in Arabic basically says to them, what have you done? What have you done? You destroyed Gaza Strip. You killed your own brothers and sisters. What have you done? Hamas leaders' answer was, that is correct. Our brothers and sisters are dead and Gaza is destroyed. But the resistance is alive and well. In other words, this issue of resistance became almost a living, breathing organism that has life of its own. This is something that Western mindset cannot understand or absorb, because it's totally so much different from what we are thinking. And this is only one example of the very convoluted mindset of the region, which again, it plays very significant role in the end of the day in the shaping of the region.
Michelle, you're up.
Ooh, I thought I was gonna do a question for the others. So I kind of want to follow up with what you just said then, and talk about, you talked about this whole situation in a way, in the strategic and political realm, and the chess game that they're playing, right? And what's going on, but can you talk a little bit? You just talked about the mindset in the Middle East where resistance can have a life of its own. Can you also talk about the way that this being a religious, like the extreme religious perspective takes precedence over international law, over some of the norms of the West that we're used to, and how that changes the region and the behaviors that we see? Because I think that's also a difference that we're not accustomed to here.
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, look, when you look at the discussion in the Arab and the Muslim world vis-a-vis the whole phenomenon of radical religiously affiliated groups, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, you find something very interesting, because there has been a growing realization within the Muslim and the Arab discussion that they are responsible for that phenomenon. There is something basically fundamentally flaws in the Arab and the Muslim culture and religions that result in those phenomena, like ISIS or like Al-Qaeda or like Hamas. I can tell you, by the way, that for example, following the terrible story of the Bibas family, there were people in the Arab world who expressed discontent. They basically said, this is not acceptable. This is a stain on Islam. This is a stain on Arab culture, and so on and so on. The challenge of that is enormously complicated, because there are many factors involved. I can provide many different explanations of it, but I would like to provide something that particularly I feel is providing some very significant explanation or code to decode this phenomenon. A Shiite poet, a woman, a very impressive one, she lost her son in attack that was carried out by ISIS, the Sunnis, in a mosque where her son was praying. And she wrote a very powerful piece about it. And she said something like, she said, look, you want to understand how do you produce ISIS? She said, if you take young people, you teach them to be condescending towards other civilizations. You basically suffocate their freedom of mind. you basically subscribe them to tough, even sometimes violently tough norms and codes. You basically don't provide them with effectively constructive skeleton. You basically result in a person that in the end of the day is going to become ISIS. And this is something which is very significant when you try to decode the understanding of what fuels that phenomenon. There are many different levels. I deliberately chosen that specific part because I could talk about religion and ideology and all those things, but I think that that specific component is something enormously significant that provides a very significant clue, not the only explanation, but a very significant clue to understand that phenomenon and where does it come from. In other words, I can quote many Arabs and Muslims, thinkers and commentators and others who basically said, look, we created a significant challenge in the shape of these radical ideologically Islamic groups, and we need to address that. We need to deal with that. I was thinking during my professional career that sometimes I met some people that were involved in those things, and I was thinking to myself, when you are growing up as a young person and you feel totally disqualified, not equipped with the tools and skills to have successfully trajectory, you feel very much impotent. You feel very much that you are powerless. When you are offered ideology, a condescending ideology, whatever the base is, weapon and sense of belonging to something, all of a sudden you are not any longer impotent. You are now imminent, and now this is a dramatic change, and that change results in another thing, the phenomenon that we saw in Gaza, or the phenomenon of ISIS.
This is so fascinating. We only have 8 minutes left, and we're 7 minutes left, and we're very sensitive to your time as well. Michelle had a really interesting question, but before that, so many questions from the audience. It's amazing. But there's a more practical question about the immediate two proxies that are biggest threat to Israel, which is Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas. Are they really, several people are asking, are they really significantly shattered or broken or weakened dramatically? Because like you said, just yesterday, we saw the huge display of power in Hezbollah with the Nasrallah funeral. And we see also all these big, when the Hamas are delivering back in an awful way, all the hostages and the bodies, they also have power, powerful displays. Is this just a shell? And these organizations inside are really broken and almost done for?
Well, I'll say something like that. They have been substantially damaged in many different ways, militarily, politically, image, and so on and so on. But it will be a mistake to argue that they have reached the end of the road. That will be a mistake. Hamas is not going to disappear. Hezbollah is not going to disappear. They're going to continue to be part of the regional system and the domestic system. In the end of the day, their power is the sum of different components of the equation. It's not only the military. I would even say it's particularly not the military one. It's particularly the way they are able to convey an agenda or a policy that is still attractive to people. It's also the component of what is their political power within their own domestic environment, namely Hamas within the Palestinians, Hezbollah within the Lebanese. When you take all these components together and you look at those components post October 7, and in the context of the impact of October 7 and the domino effect, you can clearly say, yes, those organizations have sustained a very significant setback in all those parameters. But they are not disappearing. And they do, if if circumstances will allow it, they will rebuild or try to rebuild their power in all those parameters, not only the military, the political one, the narrative. These are things that are enormously significant. So I hear people that are talking about the end of the axis of resistance or the end of Hamas or Hezbollah. That is a mistake. We should define it more accurately and understand exactly what's the trajectory ahead. They are going to be around, and we should constantly following their trajectory in the context of what I was presenting before. Are they rebuilding their political power? If so, what are the narratives that they are marketing to rebuild their political power? And other questions that has to be built, has to be asked. I can tell you that from my very, very selfish perspective, I do anticipate that I will be busy for the next 40 years.
So I guess that's a positive thing, job security. But what you say is very concerning and honestly frightening, that they're going to be around no matter what we do. There's been a lot of questions that we haven't been able to answer. Many of looking back on what the mistakes were. Why did we end up on October 7th? How did that happen? But I'm going to ask you to look ahead a little bit more. Not so much with a prediction, but maybe just leaving us with a little bit of hope. Is there what can we look at with a little hope, knowing that we have all these factions around us and they're not disappearing almost no matter what we do, it sounds like.
Look, I'm smiling because I'm defining myself as an optimistic by nature, and in the less diplomatic definition, somebody that was born as an idiot. But again, I do emphasize the need to be realistic in the way we are looking at the situation and trying to understand it, not to sell dreams or wishful thinking. And particularly talking about Israelis and Palestinians, and maybe also the domino effect that I was referring to. I do think that today, with all this very chaotic and very emotionally charged situation for everyone, for Israelis, for Palestinians, for the region, I do think that today we may witness the very early phase of something that will be different. And I mean in a positive context. What I mean is that the October 7th attack, with all these things that I was talking about, and there are many things that we didn't talk about, but they're also very substantial, in the end of the day, result in some sort of understanding that there is a need for some different path ahead. Now, it's not that we are going to jump to rosy days ahead. It's not going to happen. But I do think that we could expect a process where, technically speaking, we will see the more proactive involvement of regional players, a process that for itself is welcome because it will be in a positive context. What I'm talking about is that I do think that we are going to see involvement of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and others in building scaffoldings that will enable Israelis and Palestinians to start moving from one level to another. We are looking at a very long-term process. We are looking at a very sensitive and fragile process. We are looking at a process that will have ups and downs, but I think that we can now start looking at something like that as something that is a tangible possibility. This is something that I did not envision before October 7th. This is something that I constantly said, as I said before, Israelis and Palestinians are not in a place to have peace or two-state solution. But now, I think that we are in a place where we have the possibility of this scaffolding. The most, or I would say in parallel to that, I think it will be significantly, enormously significant to follow the inner discussion within both Israelis and Palestinian arena, and to see what the discussion is heading to, what is going to be the result of this process, which will be an enormously significant component in the trajectory ahead. I would say cautiously, very cautiously, that all in all, when I take all those segments together, I think that we can start looking at the process of this scaffoldings building. But it is a very preliminary process. It's a very long and convoluted process. A word of advice to Western audience of policymakers: always try to put a reasonable bar. Don't put a bar that you cannot achieve, because it's better to achieve small achievements rather than to have big steps that leads to failure.
Avi, I just wanted to say we have to let you go because you have another talk that you're starting in about 14 minutes. But this has been amazing. We have seen so many people who stayed here until the last minute, and there's so many questions. We really wanted to thank everybody for joining us so late and for all the amazing questions and the attention. And thank you. This was really spectacular and fascinating, and you're able to explain your insights and knowledge so well. And really thank you for your time. And thank you, of course, Michelle, for always joining and helping and moderating and adding your insights and amazing questions. So everybody, toda rabba for joining. We will share the recording once we have it with everybody who registered. Avi and Michelle, of course, will share it with your organizations as well.
It'll be on the AGMA website once it's available. And toda Avi, Am Yisrael Chai.
Am Yisrael Chai. Laila tov. Toda rabba.
להתראות.